August 1942. The Eastern Front stretches across thousands of miles of burned farmland, shattered villages, forests, rivers, and open steppe. And somewhere along the banks of the Volga River stands a city that, on the surface, seems like just another industrial center. Its name is Stalingrad. But within months, this city will become something far more important than a dot on a military map. It will become a symbol, a trap, a battlefield, and eventually, one of the most devastating turning points of the Second World War. The Battle of Stalingrad was not simply a contest between two armies. It was a collision between two enormous powers. Nazi Germany had conquered much of Europe and appeared almost unstoppable. The Soviet Union had suffered catastrophic losses since Germany invaded in June 1941. Millions of Soviet soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Entire cities had been destroyed. Yet the Soviet Union remained in the war. And now Adolf Hitler wanted a decisive victory. His eyes turned toward the south, toward the Caucasus, toward the oil fields, and toward the Volga. Stalingrad stood directly in the path. Hitler believed capturing the city could help cripple Soviet transportation and protect Germany's advance toward the Caucasus. But there was another reason. The city carried the name of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. For Hitler, that name had enormous symbolic value. For Stalin, losing it would be politically and psychologically disastrous. Neither dictator was willing to let Stalingrad fall. What followed would become one of the bloodiest urban battles in human history. And when it ended, the German Sixth Army would be trapped, starving, freezing, and dying inside the ruins of the city. More than 300,000 Axis troops would enter the Stalingrad operation. Only a fraction would eventually return home. The battle would change the course of World War II, and it would expose a terrifying truth about modern warfare. Sometimes an army does not lose because it cannot fight. Sometimes it loses because it cannot escape. Operation Blue. In the spring of 1942, Germany was preparing for another massive offensive in the Soviet Union. The previous year had failed to destroy the Soviet state. Moscow had not fallen. The Red Army had survived. And Germany now needed another strategy. The answer was the South. The German military leadership believed that capturing the oil-producing regions of the Caucasus could cripple the Soviet war machine. Modern armies require fuel. Tanks need gasoline. Aircraft need aviation fuel. Trucks need fuel. Factories require energy. The Soviet Union depended heavily on its southern oil-producing regions. If Germany could capture them, the consequences could be enormous. In June 1942, the German summer offensive began. It was known as Case Blue or Operation Blue. German forces pushed deep into Soviet territory. At first, the advance looked frighteningly successful. The German army was moving across enormous distances. Soviet defenses collapsed in several areas. German formations captured thousands of prisoners. The front seemed to be opening, but something was changing. The deeper the Germans advanced, the longer their supply lines became. Fuel had to travel hundreds of miles. Ammunition had to move behind advancing units. Food, spare parts, medical supplies, replacement soldiers, and vehicles all had to follow. The Soviet Union was enormous. Distance itself was becoming an enemy, yet Hitler remained determined. And as the German offensive split toward the Caucasus and the Volga, Stalingrad became increasingly important. The city sat on the western bank of the Volga River. The river was one of the Soviet Union's most important transportation arteries. Ships moved supplies and resources along it. The city itself was also an important industrial center. Factories produced tractors, machinery, and military equipment. But Stalingrad's greatest danger was its location. It stood directly beside the route Germany needed to threaten. If German forces reached the Volga, they could potentially disrupt Soviet movement along the river. The city therefore became a military objective. But Hitler turned it into something even more dangerous. A personal objective. Hitler chooses Stalingrad. Adolf Hitler had always understood the power of symbolism. Names mattered. Cities mattered. Images mattered. And Stalingrad carried the name of Joseph Stalin. The Soviet dictator had ruled the country for decades. To Hitler, taking the city would represent more than a military victory. It would be a humiliation of Stalin himself. The German advance toward Stalingrad accelerated. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, began striking the city. What happened next would transform Stalingrad before the main ground battle had even begun. Bombing raids turned neighborhoods into burning ruins. Factories were damaged. Homes disappeared. Roads became blocked by rubble. Smoke covered the skyline. Thousands of civilians were killed or displaced. The city was becoming almost impossible to recognize. Yet the destruction created an unexpected military advantage for the defenders. A ruined city is terrible for attackers. Every destroyed building can become a bunker. Every basement can become a shelter. Every collapsed wall can become a firing position. Every factory can become a fortress. German tanks were designed to dominate open ground. But Stalingrad was no longer open ground. It was becoming a maze. And inside that maze waited the Red Army. The sky turns black. On August 23, 1942, German forces reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. The same day, a massive German air attack struck the city. Hundreds of aircraft participated in the bombing. The results were catastrophic. Buildings burned. Industrial facilities were hit. Residential districts were destroyed. The Volga became crowded with desperate attempts to escape. The city was collapsing, but the Soviet defenders did not simply abandon it. Instead, the battle entered its most brutal phase. The German Sixth Army began pushing into Stalingrad. The objective was simple: take the city. The reality was anything but simple. He read Army Dig Zion. Soviet commanders knew what was coming. The defense of Stalingrad became a desperate operation. Men and women worked among the ruins. Soldiers dug trenches. Barricades were constructed. Weapons were positioned inside factories. Machine guns were placed in damaged buildings. Snipers occupied upper floors. Anti-tank teams waited among rubble. The Red Army was not trying to defend every inch equally. It was trying to make every inch expensive. The closer German troops came, the more difficult the battle became. The Germans had enormous experience in combined arms warfare. Their artillery was powerful. Their tanks were effective. Their infantry was disciplined. Their aircraft could dominate the sky. But in the ruins of Stalingrad, those advantages became harder to use. A tank could destroy a building, but it could not see who was waiting inside the next one. An artillery barrage could flatten a street, but Soviet soldiers could emerge from basements and tunnels afterward. German soldiers might capture a factory in the morning. By afternoon, Soviet troops could be attacking it again. The front line stopped behaving like a traditional front line. Sometimes it was only a wall, a staircase, a room, a basement, a pile of rubble. The battlefield became measured in yards, sometimes in feet. The factory districts. Some of the most famous fighting occurred around Stalingrad's industrial complexes. The Barricade factory, the Red October factory, the tractor factory. These were enormous industrial facilities. Before the war, they represented Soviet industrial power. During the battle, they became fortresses. The buildings were damaged repeatedly by artillery and bombs. Yet the Soviet defenders used the ruins to their advantage. Production and combat existed side by side. Workers repaired weapons. Soldiers fought nearby. Machinery continued operating under extraordinary conditions. The factories became symbols of Soviet resistance. The Germans could see the Volga. In some areas they were only hundreds of yards away. But reaching the river did not mean the battle was over. The Soviets kept a narrow bridgehead along the western bank, and across the Volga, fresh troops and supplies continued arriving. That river became a lifeline, the Volga River. At night, the Volga became a battlefield of its own. Boats crossed under darkness. They carried ammunition, food, medical supplies, reinforcements, and sometimes entire units. The crossing was extremely dangerous. German aircraft could attack. Artillery could reach the river. The water itself was cold and unforgiving. Yet Soviet troops continued crossing. For the Germans, the Volga looked like the final barrier. For the Soviets, it was the connection that kept Stalingrad alive. Every soldier who crossed into the city understood the basic reality. There might not be a way back. Many Soviet reinforcements reached the western bank and entered combat almost immediately. Some were sent directly toward positions under German fire. The city swallowed men faster than commanders could replace them. And still the Red Army held, house by house. Stalingrad became a nightmare of close combat. German soldiers learned that capturing a building did not mean controlling it. Soviet soldiers could occupy one floor. German soldiers could occupy another. The basement could belong to someone else entirely. Walls were blown apart to create firing positions. Rubble was used as cover. Pipes and underground passages became routes for movement. The traditional distinction between front line and rear area almost disappeared. There were no safe streets, no guaranteed safe buildings, no reliable distance from the enemy. A soldier could be killed moments after believing he had reached shelter. A sniper could wait for hours for one target. Artillery could destroy a position without warning. The sounds became constant. Machine guns, rifles, mortars, artillery, aircraft, explosions, shouting, metal collapsing under fire, and then, sometimes, silence. That silence could be even more frightening, because everyone knew the battle could begin again at any moment. The snipers of Stalingrad. Among the many stories to emerge from the battle were the Soviet snipers. One of the most famous was Vasily Zaitsev, a Soviet naval infantryman turned sniper. Zaitsev became a symbol of Soviet resistance. His reputation grew rapidly. Snipers operated in an environment where patience could be more valuable than speed. A sniper might lie motionless for hours, sometimes longer. The ruined city provided endless hiding places. Broken windows, collapsed walls, factory machinery, rubble, darkened rooms. The objective was not simply to shoot, it was to survive. A sniper who exposed his position could quickly become a target himself. The sniper war became part of the psychological battle. German soldiers knew that movement could attract attention. Soviet soldiers knew the same. Stalingrad turned visibility into danger. The city itself seemed to watch. The battle becomes a grinder. By October, the German Sixth Army had captured large portions of Stalingrad. To an observer looking at a map, the Germans appeared close to victory, but the map concealed the reality. The German army was exhausted. Its casualties were mounting. Units were repeatedly thrown into attacks against heavily defended positions. The same areas changed hands again and again, and German forces were increasingly concentrated inside the city. That concentration would eventually become one of the greatest weaknesses in the entire operation. Outside Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army depended heavily on its allies. Romanian, Italian, Hungarian, and other Axis formations protected sections of the enormous German front. These troops were holding open terrain far away from the ruins. The Germans believed the Soviet threat remained manageable, but the Red Army was preparing something much larger. The Soviets were not simply trying to save Stalingrad. They were preparing to destroy the army attacking it. The secret Soviet plan. Behind the front lines, Soviet commanders were preparing a massive counteroffensive. The operation was called Uranus. Its purpose was not to attack the strongest German positions inside Stalingrad. It was to attack the weaker forces protecting the German flanks. The plan was brutally simple. Strike north and south of Stalingrad, break through the Axis defenses, then move toward each other, and close the trap. The Germans had concentrated their strongest formations inside the city. Their flanks were held by armies that had fewer tanks, fewer anti-tank weapons, and weaker defensive capabilities. Soviet commanders understood the vulnerability. The Red Army began assembling enormous forces: tanks, artillery, infantry, aircraft, supplies. The preparations were conducted with secrecy and deception. The Germans were still focused on Stalingrad, and that was exactly what the Soviets wanted. November 19, 1942. Before sunrise on November 19, the Soviet counteroffensive began. Massive artillery barrages struck Romanian positions northwest of Stalingrad. The ground shook. Soviet guns fired in enormous numbers. Then tanks and infantry moved forward. The Romanian defenses began to collapse. The next day, Soviet forces attacked from the south. The plan was now in motion. The Red Army was not trying to take another neighborhood. It was trying to encircle an entire German army. Soviet troops advanced rapidly. German commanders struggled to understand what was happening. The main German forces were still deep inside Stalingrad, and now the battlefield outside the city was collapsing. The two Soviet forces pushed toward each other. On November 23, they met near Kalach. The encirclement was complete. Inside the pocket were roughly 250,000 Axis personnel, including the German Sixth Army and elements of other formations. The German soldiers had gone from attacking the city to being trapped inside it. The battle had changed completely. The trap closes. Inside the encirclement, confusion spread. The soldiers had not been prepared for a prolonged siege. Their supply system was already strained. Now they were cut off from their main lines of communication. Food became scarce. Ammunition became precious. Fuel became critical. Medical supplies dwindled. The German army had become dependent on the Luftwaffe. Aircraft were expected to supply the encircled forces from the air, but this created another enormous problem. The amount of supplies required was far greater than what German aircraft could reliably deliver. Weather made things worse. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft defenses made flights dangerous. Airfields inside the pocket became increasingly vulnerable, and the winter was coming. Hitler refuses to retreat. At this moment, German commanders faced a crucial decision: break out, or remain inside the pocket. A breakout might have been possible earlier, but Hitler refused. He ordered the Sixth Army to hold Stalingrad. The city had become more than a battlefield. It had become a matter of prestige. Hitler believed the trapped army could be supplied from the air and eventually relieved by German forces attacking from outside. The Sixth Army was told to wait, but waiting was deadly. Every day inside the pocket consumed food, ammunition, fuel, medicine, and human lives. The Soviet forces surrounding them were growing stronger. The German soldiers were becoming weaker, and winter was arriving. The winter of death. The winter of 1942-43 was brutal. Temperatures fell dramatically. Snow covered the battlefield. Wind swept through ruined buildings. Soldiers who lacked proper winter clothing suffered terribly. Horses died. Vehicles stopped functioning. Fuel shortages made transportation increasingly difficult. Food became one of the most important weapons in the battle. Hunger weakened soldiers before bullets ever reached them. Men became exhausted. Diseases spread. Wounded soldiers crowded into inadequate medical facilities. Some could no longer walk. Others were too weak to fight. Yet the fighting continued. The Soviet forces kept tightening the ring. German soldiers defended positions with fewer resources every day. The city that Hitler had demanded was now becoming a prison. The air bridge failed. The Luftwaffe attempted to maintain an air bridge into Stalingrad, but the promise was unrealistic. The encircled forces required huge quantities of supplies. Aircraft had to deliver food, ammunition, fuel, and medical equipment, but the Germans could not reliably provide enough. Aircraft were lost. Weather disrupted operations. Soviet forces attacked airfields. Some supplies never arrived. Others arrived in quantities too small to change the situation. The air bridge could not replace a functioning ground supply line. The Sixth Army was starving. And outside the pocket, Germany was preparing one final attempt to save it. Operation Winter Storm. In December 1942, German forces launched Operation Winter Storm. The goal was to break through to Stalingrad. The relief force included powerful armored formations. For a brief moment, hope returned. German troops advanced toward the encircled army. They came closer. But the distance between the relief forces and the trapped Sixth Army remained significant, and the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The German forces outside the pocket faced Soviet resistance. Meanwhile, Hitler continued to insist that the Sixth Army hold its positions. The trapped troops could not simply move toward the relief force. The opportunity for a coordinated breakout was disappearing. Eventually, the German relief effort stalled. The Sixth Army remained trapped. The point of no return by the end of December. The situation was catastrophic. Inside Stalingrad, soldiers were starving. Some survived on extremely limited rations. Horses had become food. The wounded were suffering without adequate medical care. Ammunition shortages limited resistance. The Soviet ring was becoming stronger. The Germans were now defending an increasingly smaller area, and the soldiers understood something that had become impossible to ignore. There was no longer a realistic path to victory. The only question was how long they could survive. Operation Ring. In January 1943, the Soviet Union began the final phase of the battle, Operation Ring. The objective was to destroy the remaining German forces inside the pocket. The Soviet army had enormous advantages in artillery and manpower. The German defenders were exhausted. The front contracted. Airfields were lost. The last meaningful supply routes disappeared. Soviet troops pushed deeper into the pocket. The German army was breaking apart. On January 31, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered in the southern pocket. It was a remarkable moment. Hitler had promoted Paulus to Field Marshal only days earlier. The implication was clear. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered to an enemy, but Paulus refused to die for Hitler's political symbolism. He surrendered. Other German forces continued fighting for several more days. On February 2nd, organized German resistance in Stalingrad finally ended. The battle was over. The silence after the gunfire. The ruins of Stalingrad were almost impossible to comprehend. Buildings had been reduced to skeletons. Streets were buried beneath rubble. Factories stood damaged and burned. Thousands of bodies remained across the battlefield. The survivors were exhausted, and the German prisoners were in terrible condition. Of the roughly 90,000 German and Axis troops captured at the end of the battle, only a minority would eventually return home. Many died in captivity from disease, starvation, exposure, and exhaustion. The final human cost of Stalingrad was staggering. Military and civilian casualties combined reached well into the hundreds of thousands, with estimates varying significantly depending on definitions and sources. The battle had consumed entire generations of young men, but the numbers alone cannot explain what happened. Stalingrad was not simply a number on a casualty report. It was a city destroyed, families separated, soldiers buried beneath rubble, and an army that disappeared into captivity. Why Stalingrad mattered. The significance of Stalingrad went far beyond the city. The German Sixth Army was destroyed as an effective fighting formation. The Axis position in southern Russia had been severely damaged. The Soviet Union had demonstrated that it could not only survive Germany's offensives, it could destroy them. Before Stalingrad, Germany still appeared capable of dictating the strategic direction of the Eastern Front. After Stalingrad, the momentum increasingly shifted toward the Soviet Union. Germany would continue fighting. It would continue launching offensives. It would continue inflicting enormous casualties. But the strategic initiative was slipping away. Stalingrad became a symbol of the change. The German army had marched deep into Soviet territory. Now it was retreating, and the Red Army was beginning the long journey west. The human cost. It is easy to describe Stalingrad through maps, arrows, numbers, tank symbols, front lines. But every arrow represented people. The soldiers fighting there were young. Many were barely adults. Some had families thousands of miles away. Some had never been outside their home region. Soviet soldiers entered the city knowing they could die within hours. German soldiers entered believing victory was still possible. Both sides endured artillery, cold, hunger, fear, exhaustion. The battle was brutal beyond ordinary military experience. There were no clean lines, no comfortable rear areas, no certainty that the next minute would be survivable, and civilians suffered terribly. Stalingrad had been home to hundreds of thousands of people before the battle. Many were killed, others fled, others remained trapped among the ruins. The city became a battlefield where military necessity and human survival collided every day. The psychological war. Stalingrad was also a battle of will. The Soviet leadership demanded resistance. The German leadership demanded obedience. Both sides understood that morale mattered. The Soviets needed their soldiers to believe that surrender was unacceptable. The Germans needed their soldiers to believe that relief was coming. As the battle continued, those beliefs were tested. For the Soviets, every day the city remained in their hands was proof that Germany could be resisted. For the Germans, every day inside the pocket became evidence that promises of victory could not solve the physical realities of war. Hunger cannot be defeated by propaganda. Cold cannot be defeated by orders. Ammunition cannot be created by willpower, and an encircled army cannot survive indefinitely without supplies. Stalingrad demonstrated the brutal relationship between strategy and logistics. The battle of distance. One of the greatest lessons of Stalingrad was that geography can kill an army. Germany's advance had moved far beyond its original supply infrastructure. Roads were poor. Railways were limited. Distances were enormous. Every mile forward created another mile that supplies had to travel. At first, speed hid the problem. German armies advanced rapidly, but eventually the logistical system began to strain. By the time the Sixth Army was trapped, the distance between German forces and their supply bases had become a critical weakness. The Red Army exploited it. The Germans had won tactical victories inside Stalingrad, but the Soviet Union won the larger strategic contest outside the city. That distinction changed the war. The myth of the unstoppable German army. Before Stalingrad, Nazi Germany had conquered Poland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, and much of Eastern Europe. The German military machine had developed a reputation for speed and effectiveness. Blitzkrieg had become a terrifying word, but the Soviet Union was different. Its territory was enormous. Its population was huge. Its industrial base could be moved east. Its military could absorb staggering losses and continue fighting. The Red Army learned. It adapted. It became more experienced. And at Stalingrad, it demonstrated the ability to conduct a massive strategic encirclement against one of Germany's most powerful armies. The German army was not suddenly incompetent. The Soviet military had become increasingly capable, and the conditions of the Eastern Front were becoming increasingly hostile to Germany. Stalingrad revealed that Germany could be defeated on a massive scale. What happened to the survivors? For the surviving German prisoners, the war did not end when the guns fell silent. Many were transported away from Stalingrad. Some traveled by train. Others marched. Many were sick. Some were wounded. Others were suffering from malnutrition. Thousands died before reaching prisoner of war camps. Those who survived captivity could remain prisoners for years. Some would not return to Germany until long after the war ended. For Soviet soldiers, survival also came at a cost. Many had lost friends, brothers, parents, and entire units. Victory did not restore the dead. The city itself had to be rebuilt. Stalingrad had survived, but it had paid an almost unimaginable price. The city rises again. After the battle, Stalingrad was transformed. The ruins became symbols of sacrifice. The Soviet government celebrated the victory as one of the greatest achievements of the war. Medals were awarded. Memorials were created. The city became a destination for veterans and visitors. Eventually, Stalingrad itself would be renamed Volgograd, but the memory of the battle remained, because the name Stalingrad had become permanently connected to the moment when Hitler's expansion reached its limit. Stalingrad and the road to Berlin. The Battle of Stalingrad did not end World War II. Germany still had enormous military power. The war would continue for more than 2 years. There would be more massive battles, more offensives, more deaths, and more destruction. But the strategic direction of the Eastern Front had changed. The Soviet Union increasingly took the initiative. In 1943 came the Battle of Kursk. Then Soviet offensives pushed German forces westward. In 1944, the Red Army destroyed large portions of Germany's Army Group Center during Operation Bagration. Soviet forces moved through Eastern Europe, and in 1945 they reached Germany. Berlin became the final battlefield. The Nazi regime collapsed. Hitler died. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Stalingrad had been fought nearly 3 years earlier, but the road to Berlin had passed through its ruins. The American view of Stalingrad. For American audiences, Stalingrad can sometimes feel like a distant battle on the other side of the world, but its importance to the larger Allied war effort was enormous. The United States was fighting Germany in North Africa, Italy, the Atlantic, and eventually Western Europe. American industry was producing weapons, aircraft, vehicles, ammunition, and supplies on a gigantic scale. Britain was fighting to survive and maintain its global war effort. But on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union was fighting the largest concentration of German military power. The scale was extraordinary. Millions of soldiers fought across the Eastern Front. The casualties were enormous. The Soviet Union suffered catastrophic losses, and Germany committed a huge portion of its military strength to the war against the USSR. Stalingrad therefore mattered to the entire Allied war effort. The destruction of the Sixth Army reduced German military strength at a critical moment. It also forced Germany to reconsider how much it could accomplish in the East. The war was becoming a conflict Germany could no longer control. The battle that changed the image of Hitler. Stalingrad also damaged Hitler's reputation inside his own military. The German army had previously survived difficult situations through maneuver and retreat, but Hitler increasingly interfered directly with military operations. At Stalingrad, his refusal to authorize a timely breakout proved catastrophic. His obsession with holding the city contributed to the destruction of the Sixth Army. The battle became evidence that political ideology could override military reality. Hitler had demanded that Stalingrad be held. His generals had warned of danger. The result was disaster. The German army had entered the city as an instrument of conquest. It left as a symbol of defeat. The battle that never really ended. Even after February 2, 1943, Stalingrad continued to influence the war. Soviet commanders had gained confidence. German commanders